like strangers in these parts. I don't exactly know why, but they don't. They're a funny lot.
Welcome to episode 42 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of colonialism, with two films that suggest that the price for oppression and cultural appropriation is a very heavy one. So first up, we have another Val Lewton production from RKO Studios, which is I Walked with a Zombie, from 1943. This was directed by Jacques Tourneur and stars Francis D., Tom Conway, Edith Barrett and Christine Gordon. Then we follow this with an offering from Hammer Studios with The Reptile from 1966. This was directed by John Gilling and stars Jennifer Daniel, Noel Willman, Ray Barrett and Jacqueline Pearce. Along the way, we'll be discussing the origins of Haitian Vaudou, the Haitian Revolution, the career of actor Michael Ripper, and much, much more. But before we begin our episode properly, I would just like to say that my intention for this episode is to hopefully use it as some form of fundraiser for an art school on the island of Haiti that is run by a young man called Ronnie. Haiti, as you may know, and as we will discuss later, is a very turbulent country, and this young guy does all that he can to bring creativity, security, and a sense of community into the lives of young children on the island. And while I fully appreciate that times are tough for everyone financially right now, and let's face it, they're only going to get tougher, if anyone can make any donation at all to the school's GoFundMe, even if it is the price of a cup of coffee, I would be really grateful. I'm going to link his Instagram and GoFundMe in the show notes, so if you can show some support and send some love their way, it would be very much appreciated. And now, with that being said, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources and references that I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in these show notes. So when discussing I Walked with the Zombie, I have referenced the books I Walked with the Zombie by Clive Dawson, which is published as part of the Devil's Advocate series of books from Liverpool University Press. I've also referenced the Book of the Dead, The Complete History of Zombie Cinema by Jamie Russell, Horror Noir, A History of the Black American Horror Film from the 1890s to the present by Robin R. Means Coleman, Jacques Tourneur, The Cinema of Nightfall by Chris Fujiwara, and Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror by Joel E. Siegel. And when discussing The Reptile, I have referred to the books English Gothic by Jonathan Rigby, Hammer Films, An Exhaustive Filmography by Tom Johnson and Deborah Del Vecchio, and issue 23 of Little Shop of Horrors magazine, which covers both the plague of the zombies and the making of the reptile. We've talked about Val Lewton's horror unit at RKO Studios several times now, beginning in episode 2 and then again in episodes 8, 21 and 30. I Walked with the Zombie was the second film produced by the unit and also the second of 3 films that Val Lewton made with director Jacques Tourneur. It was inspired by an article published in the American Weekly in 1942 titled I Met a Zombie, written by journalist Inez Wallace. The fascination that America developed with the island of Haiti and the notion of the zombie originated mainly with the publication of the book The Magic Island, written by William Seabrook and published in 1929. We discussed this back in episode 37, and listeners of that episode will remember that this was a particularly sensationalist travelogue, which has since been widely condemned for its exaggeration and its racial stereotyping. Nevertheless, it still became a bestseller, leading to a stage play called Zombie that premiered on Broadway on February the 10th, 1932. Written by a playwright called Kenneth Webb, it was critically panned on its premiere, described as wretchedly acted and deplorably written, and rather unsurprisingly, given those reviews, it only ran for 21 performances, closing just 17 days after opening on February the 27th. However, it was remounted in Chicago in March of that year, where it was repackaged as a comedy and ran for 2 months. It also inspired the Bela Lugosi movie White Zombie, which was released in 1932. And much like the play, the film didn't fare very well with the critics either. The New York World Telegram said, quote, "The plot is really ridiculous, but not so startling as the acting," end quote, while the New York Evening Post wrote that the film tried to out-Frankenstein Frankenstein and was, quote, "so earnest in its attempt to be thrilling that it overreaches its mark and resolves into an unintentional and often hilarious comedy," end quote. But the criticism did little to hamper the film's success, and it did very well at the box office for an independent film of the time. Considered to be the first full-length zombie movie, and once described as the archetype and model for all zombie cinema, it led to a string of similarly themed films. One of the earliest of these was called Black Moon, which was released in 1934 and starred Jack Holt and Fay Wray. Being completely blunt, this is perhaps one of the most racist films that I've ever seen, centering on a beautiful white woman who is lured into ritual sacrifice and voodoo on a distant tropical island. Others include Revolt of the Zombies in 1936, and in the same year, Uanga, though this too received poor reviews and was described as crudely produced, badly acted, and clumsily built. Of all of the films on the subject made at the time, I Walked with a Zombie is probably the most respectful, though, as you've just heard, the bar was set pretty low. And while it may have its flaws, and more on those later, at the very least Val Lewton and his team set out to treat the spiritual practice with a greater degree of respect than their predecessors, and also attempted to include subtext about the legacy of the slave trade. The Caribbean island that would eventually be divided into the countries we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic was, quote-unquote, discovered by Christopher Columbus in October 1492, who named the land Hispaniola. At the time, the island was populated by a people known as the Taíno, the indigenous people of most of the West Indies, and part of the Arawak group of indigenous people of the Americas. Although they welcomed Columbus and his men when they first landed on the island, as we know through much of history, this proved to be a terrible mistake, as the colonists institutionalized slavery on the island and turned it into a major business. A land that was rich in gold and copper and soon to be one of the largest sugar providers in the world, the island became home to enormous sugar plantations and mining operations, all of which were reliant on the enslaved Taíno population, who were, in turn, treated barbarically by the Spanish. In addition to working the Taíno as slaves on the island, the Spanish also attempted to send some back to Spain. In 1495, the Spaniards sent 500 captives back to their homeland, but 200 did not survive the voyage, and the others all died shortly afterwards. In response to the brutality, some of the people fought back and escaped into remote parts of the island's mountains, forming hidden communities known as Maroons or Cimarron. But attempts at resistance were met with severe reprisals, and the Spanish would often destroy crops to starve the Taíno as punishment. It is not known how many Taíno people were on the island at the time of Columbus's arrival, but overwork, slavery, brutality, and European diseases brought in by the Spanish soon decimated the population. Between 1492 and 1494, 1/3 of the population on the island had died, and by 1514, this number had increased to 92%. So, think about that next time someone suggests celebrating Columbus Day. As a result, the rate of death left a void on the plantations and in the mines, a void which the Spanish filled through the African slave trade. Some newly arrived slaves were able to escape and join the maroon communities in the mountains, and in 1519 they mounted a slave rebellion that was eventually crushed by the Spanish in the 1520s. By the 1530s, there were approximately 20,000 enslaved Africans on the island, which had risen to 30,000 by the 1540s. In 1697, the Spanish ceded control of the western part of the island to the French, who named the new territory Saint-Domingue. This colony, based on the export of crops, sugarcane and coffee, would become one of the richest in the world, all paid for in death and blood by an increasing number of slaves brought to work on the island by the French. By 1681, there were 2,000 enslaved people in the colony, and by 1789, there were almost 500,000. The harsh conditions and diseases, including malaria and yellow fever, ensured a high mortality rate, and at least 50% of those brought from Africa died within a year of arriving. Enslaved people were brought to the island from the Congo, Biafra, which we now know as Nigeria and Cameroon, and the area which we now know as Benin. To limit communication and thus reduce the likelihood of rebellion, the groups were mixed together, which gradually led to the development of a new common language, Haitian Creole, which combines elements of French vocabulary with the grammatical structure and syntax of the enslaved people's original birthplaces. It also, very importantly for this episode, gave rise to a new spiritual practice, known in the West and in movies as voodoo, but more properly termed vaudou. This is an example of religious syncretism, combining the spiritual practice of the slaves' homelands to create a merged belief system. And so we can therefore see vaudou as being a religion born of and then evolving further from the slave trade. Contrary to popular culture, vaudou can be seen as a monotheistic practice in that there is one god, bon Dieu, or good God, the creator of all things. However, unlike in the Abrahamic religions, the vaudou god is distant and remote and can be seen more as a form of conscious energy that exists within and through all things. Busy creating and recreating the world over and over, bon Dieu does not have time for the trivialities of human life. However, between God and man there are spirits, called Noir or lower, and these are the figures that we might often see misrepresented in popular culture. The Loire are divided into nations or families of spirits. For example, you have the Rada Loire, who are seen as older and slightly cooler in temperament, and these include Papa Legba, Dambala, and Azuli Freda. There are also the Petro Loire, who are seen as younger with a hotter temperament, which includes Azili Dantor and Met Kafu, sometimes known as Carrefour or the Crossroads, and there are also the Guédé, or the spirits of the dead, led by Baron Lacroix, Baron Semetier, and Baron Samedi. When the French and the Spanish brought the slaves to the island, they also enforced Catholicism. In 1685, the French king Louis XIV introduced what was called the Code Noir, which forced baptism on arrival, attempting to remove freedom of thought and religious practice as well as physical liberty. To escape punishment and maintain their traditions, over years the enslaved linked their spirits to images of the Catholic saints, allowing them to continue their practice in disguise. Azuli Freda became synchronized with the image of the Mater Dolorosa, or Our Lady of Sorrows. Papa Legba became linked with St. Lazarus, or sometimes St. Peter, and Baron Samedi became linked to St. Martin de Porres, or St. Martin of the Poor. Within this climate, the figure of the zombie emerged, probably as a mirror to the inhumanity enacted by the French and Spanish, and as a projection of the horrors seen every day. In vaudou, after death, one returns to Guinea, literally Africa, unless one is made into a zombie, an eternal being forced to work as a slave forever. No mind, no control, no free will, just endless forced labour for all eternity. Quite literally a living death. By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue produced 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the sugar imported by France and Britain. The colony was not only the most profitable possession of the French colonial empire, it was also the wealthiest and most prosperous colony in the Caribbean. The largest sugar plantations and concentration of the enslaved were in the north of the island, and even by the standards of the Caribbean, the French slave masters were extremely cruel. When slaves attempted to escape or disobeyed their quote-unquote masters, they were subject to whipping or more extreme torture, such as castration or burning, despite such practices being outlawed by the 1685 Code Noir. Some still managed to escape and joined other groups of Maroons in the mountains and hillsides, who often conducted violent raids on the island's sugar plantations. Although the numbers of these groups grew into the thousands, they lacked the strategy and coordination to accomplish lasting objectives. The first truly effective Maroon leader to emerge was a charismatic voodoo priest named Francois Macandal, who united the various groups and established a network of secret organizations among the plantation slaves, which led to a rebellion from 1751 to 1757. Although he was captured by the French and then burned at the stake in 1758, his legacy continued, and armed Maroon bands persisted in raids and violence towards the plantations after his death. A few years later, the French Revolution of 1789 led to the publication in France of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, declaring all men free and equal. Although the declaration was ambiguous as to whether the equality applied to the colonies, white plantation owners saw it as an opportunity to gain independence from France, allowing them to take full control of the island and create trade regulations that would further their own wealth and power. The enslaved population on the island began to hear of the agitation for independence and quickly understood that if independence were to be led by the slave masters, it would mean even harsher treatment and increased injustice for the African population. On the 14th of August 1791, a Vodou ceremony was held in Bois Cayman, or the Crocodile Woods, and on the 21st of August, the slaves of Saint-Domingue rose in revolt. The long years of oppression and violence by the planters came back to them threefold, and the revolution was marked by extreme violence from the very start. But given what had gone on in the centuries before, one can hardly be surprised, and might even, dare I say it, call it karma. Within weeks, the number of slaves who joined the revolution in the north of the island reached 100,000, and within the next 2 months, as violence escalated, 4,000 whites were killed, and hundreds of sugar, coffee, and indigo plantations were destroyed. The revolution continued for a further 12 years, and only came to an end on January the 1st, 1804, resulting in the abolition of slavery and the establishment of Haiti as the first black independent republic. There is, of course, much more to the Haitian Revolution and indeed the history of Haiti than this. But what is important for this week's episode is that the revolution in Haiti was viewed, particularly from the southern states of America, as an ominous warning. The relationship of Haitian Vodou to the revolution could also not be denied, and the spiritual practice began to earn a reputation outside of Haiti as being dark, dangerous, and violent. It was a religion that had been born of slavery and that had also fed into the revolution, and for those watching from across the water, the notion was terrifying. But France, which lost its most profitable colony in the process, demanded financial reparation for loss of property, in which they included the enslaved. In 1825, the country demanded a compensation payment of 150 million francs, which today would be worth anywhere between $1 to $7 billion. This was to be paid in annual payments of 30 million over a 5-year period. Haiti was forced to take out high interest rate loans for the first 30 million francs, creating a double debt that resulted in 80% of the country's wealth being used for repayments at certain periods. In 1838, France agreed to reduce the remaining debt, how very generous of them, to 60 million to be paid over a 30-year period. Although there were several revolutions in France after the date of the initial agreement, successive governments, regardless of their political leanings, continued to enforce the debt, coercing Haiti to pay the full amount. Haiti had to take out another loan in 1875 to pay back the final portion, and even after the French compensation was paid, the country had to continue repaying the other loans. In 1911, the government of the United States, supported by a consortium of American investors, including the National City Bank of New York, took control of the Haitian treasury to guarantee that interest repayments continued, and in 1922 the rest of Haiti's debt was moved to be paid to American investors. A New York Times article published in 2022 states that it took until 1947 for Haiti to finally pay off all of the associated interest on the loans, and this all went to the National City Bank of New York, which is now known as Citibank. These repayments have been called a case of odious debt by historians and activists, who have cited them as being responsible for Haiti's poverty today. And although in 2016 the French Parliament repealed the 1825 ordinance, no reparations were offered by France to Haiti as a result. Despite finally gaining independence in 1804, Haiti was only recognized as a republic by the US in 1861 under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. The location of the country made it a perfect site for a naval base to protect the US from European powers, and its rich mineral sources, sugar and coffee plantations were of course also incredibly appealing. However, the country was incredibly unstable. Between 1888 and 1915, no Haitian president completed his 7-year term. 10 were killed or overthrown, and only 1 died of natural causes. In 1868, President Andrew Johnson suggested the annexation of the whole of the island of Hispaniola to create a US presence in the Caribbean. Although this was not followed through, American warships were active in Haitian waters 17 times between 1862 and 1915, and in 1888, Assistant Secretary of State Alvy A. Addy described the country as, quote, a public nuisance at our door, end quote. By the 1890s, due to the various debt repayments, Haiti was forced to export most of its goods and had to rely on imports from the US. American businesses began to expand their presence in the country, and, as you can imagine, the desire to expand grew even further. In 1909, the president of the National City Bank of New York, to whom Haiti now owed a significant amount of money, began to plot the bank's complete takeover of Haiti's financial system. A year later, the US Department of State, backed by a consortium of American investors, acquired a managing stake in the National Bank of Haiti. And in 1914, US President Woodrow Wilson sent in Marines, who removed $500,000 of the bank's reserves for supposed safekeeping in New York. The assassination of the Haitian president a year later then prompted Wilson to invade Haiti with the aim of maintaining control of the island and to protect US assets. And there is very little doubt that Wilson was influenced in this decision by, yes, you guessed it, the National City Bank of New York. The US installed a puppet president and also created a new constitution in 1918, ensuring that foreign powers could own Haitian land. The country remained under US military rule until 1934, a period that was defined by increasing violence towards the population and also, once again, forced labour. This then was the landscape against which William Seabrook wrote his book, The Magic Island, and one can see why it was politically expedient for him to write a work that demonised the spiritual practice of voodoo and also reduced the population of the island to 2-dimensional stereotypes. The work portrayed Haitians as superstitious and their religious beliefs as malevolent. No wonder readers must have thought that they needed US troops to keep the peace. As I mentioned in episode 37, the book was a sensation, although in hindsight it has been condemned as the exaggerated and nonsensical piece of US propaganda that it actually was. Its depiction of voodoo, building on from the fear of revolution, created a dangerous stereotype, and it's one that sadly still exists to this day. The word voodoo is now a derogatory term, used to stereotype people as being superstitious and unprepared for freedom, the right to vote, and the ability to hold public office. It's also found its way into language as a pejorative term in a number of contexts, such as the term voodoo economics. And of course, there is also the incredibly biased portrayal in media, from films like White Zombie through to 1987's Angel Heart and 2013's American Horror Story Coven. Gosh, Ryan Murphy inappropriately sensationalizing something. Who would have thought? But although the Magic Island was certainly the key inspiration for White Zombie and many of the films that followed, the inspiration for I Walked with a Zombie came from another source, although it has been claimed that much of this source was simply a copy and paste attempt from Wallace's bestseller. This source was an article written by an actress and writer called Inez Wallace, which was published in a magazine called The American Weekly on Sunday, the 3rd of May, 1942. A rather trashy article, to say the least. It has been described by writer Jamie Russell as, quote, a blatantly sensational piece of pulp anthropology that owed as much to movies like Uwanga or White Zombie as it did to serious research, end quote. Presented as a supposedly truthful account of the writer's experiences during a 6-month tour of the West Indies, the article was divided into 3 sections. The first was a discussion about zombies between Wallace and a plantation worker aboard a ship bound for Haiti. The second detailed an encounter between Wallace and what she called a mindless thing in a cane plantation on the island. And the third was a discussion between Wallace and a, quote, prominent native physician, end quote, who informed her that zombies are indeed real and are the victims of a potent drug that, quote, rots the brain beyond restoration, end quote. Accompanied by an illustration that wouldn't seem out of place in an issue of Tales from the Crypt, the article is full of lurid descriptions, including her account of her supposed zombie encounter. I'm going to read directly from the article here, and as I mentioned, it is sensationalist trash, putting it mildly. It's also written with all of the cultural sensitivity that one might expect, but I think it's important for you to hear her writing, in her own words, to understand American attitudes towards Haiti at the time. Quote, his face was neither the bronze of the Jamaican Negro, nor the ebony black of the Haitian I had come to know in these mountains. The colour was a sickly grey, like fresh Russian caviar, and his skin, drawn tight over his bones, resembled old parchment. In order to avoid hitting him, I called out, but he made no effort to move from the pathway. There wasn't another soul about, and telling myself I should not be afraid of this old man, I pulled up beside him. He muttered an unintelligible jumble of something, which wasn't exactly words, wasn't in fact like anything I'd ever heard before in my life. I wondered vaguely whether they had cut out people's tongues in Haiti as they did with the Roman slaves of old, and if this man could have lost his tongue. But just then my horse started acting so strangely that I pulled her up sharply. She wasn't having any part of the mysterious stranger though, bit or no bit. Instead, she shied and turned around 3 times, losing me on the 3rd turn and bolting down the mountain path towards Port-au-Prince. Slowly, I stopped to pick up my sun helmet and, as I did, looked levelly at my wayside apparition. And in that second, I realised 2 things. I saw him, but he didn't see me. He was an imbecile. He was insane. Almost over my head, in a breadfruit tree, a white owl hooted, to-wit-to-woo. And in that instant I knew the answer. The thing before me was a zombie. End quote. Rather unsurprisingly, this incredibly florid piece of writing caused quite a controversy, eliciting rebuttals from both the then Consul General of Haiti and also his predecessor, a letter was written to the publication suggesting that the zombie Wallace had met in the cane fields was probably someone suffering from mental illness, saying that he was possibly, quote, a poor harmless lunatic who should at present be confined to one of the island's numerous asylums, end quote. Another letter, though, was written directly to Wallace herself, accusing her work of being the product of a childish imagination and condemning her for creating discord and ill feeling among the United Nations. It finished by calling her work hypocritical, disgusting, and repulsive. Wallace offered to write a new article, but the damage was already done, feeding into the multitude of stereotypes that had begun with Seabrook and had continued with the release of films like White Zombie and Black Moon. But it also caught the attention of the story department at RKO Studios. An internal report from the studio described the article as an idea fragment that could be used as the bare nucleus of a horror thriller, but it did go on to say that a complete plot would have to be built around the setup for picture purposes. The head of the department immediately contacted Wallace and offered to purchase the film rights. Wallace agreed, provided that she could also submit an original screen story, saying, quote, this zombie material is so highly specialized that, unless one knows all of the angles, it's apt to sound corny, end quote, which is a bit rich given the quality of her own writing. Nevertheless, the studio agreed, and Wallace duly submitted her story outline a few days later, a 29-page document provisionally titled Zombies Walked With Me. Perhaps realizing that Wallace's proposed title held as much poetry as her original article, the studio very wisely changed it to I Walked With a Zombie, and then presented it to Val Lewton. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is, of course, I Walked With a Zombie from 1943. This was directed by Jacques Tourneur and stars Francis D., Tom Conway, Edith Barrett, and Christine Gordon. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so all of my usual warnings apply. Val Lewton had barely begun working on his unit's debut feature, Cat People, when the head of production, Charles Kerner, called him into his office. During the meeting, Kerner told him that his follow-up would be based on Wallace's treatment, and that the studio had already hired a writer, Kurt Siodmak, to develop the screenplay. The horror unit's editor, Mark Robson, later recalled that Lewton did not take the news very well, saying that when he returned from the meeting, his face was white and his manner impossibly gloomy. Lewton, we have to remember, had much more interest in the poetry of horror and did not like being dictated to by the studio, especially when he was given a title as garish as I Walked With a Zombie. He spent the rest of the day in an incredibly irritable mood, and his colleagues began to dread his return the next morning. But, as it turned out, their concerns weren't necessary. Lewton had had an idea overnight, and the next day he came in unusually early and in an incredibly happy mood. He announced to his team that, much like Cat People, he would use the horror premise to tell a very different story than the one the studio intended. Beneath the surface of the zombie horror title, he intended to make a version of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, a novel that he had originally researched for film when he worked for producer David O. Selznick. Lewton and Siodmak began developing the screenplay with this premise, but unfortunately, the results did not live up to expectations. Lewton was, as we all know by now, a master of subtlety and ambiguity, and the screenplay that Siodmak delivered was anything but that. It might have contained the core elements that he and Lewton had discussed, but it was very far from the film that we see on screen today. Realizing that Siodmak was not the right person to undertake the necessary rewrites, Lewton released him from his contract on the same day that the screenplay was submitted. Nothing like making a fast decision. The rewrites were given to a writer named Ardell Ray, who joined the unit a month later. She and Lewton then set about drastically rewriting Siodmak's screenplay, incorporating elements not only from Jane Eyre, but also from the novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I Walked with the Zombie tells the story of a nurse called Betsy Connell, played by Frances D. She accepts a position on the Caribbean island of St. Sebastian to care for the invalid wife of a plantation owner named Paul Holland. Knowing little more than that, but tempted by romantic notions of sunshine and palm trees, Betsy accepts the job and soon finds herself on a sailing ship bound for the island. Once there, she meets her patient Jessica, a tragic figure who cannot communicate and who wanders the house and grounds late at night. The locals believe that Jessica is a zombie, but the doctor believes that she has suffered brain damage from a tropical fever. It has to be said, though, that even he describes her condition in somewhat magical terms, calling her, quote, a sleepwalker who can never be awakened, feeling nothing, knowing nothing, end quote. As she gradually falls in love with Paul Holland, Betsy tries several methods to cure her patient. These include a dangerous insulin therapy, and when that doesn't work, she finally resorts to voodoo in an attempt to speed her recovery. Naturally enough, it all ends in tragedy, though not necessarily in the way that one might expect. So much like Jane Eyre, this film is also a love story, charting the relationship between Betsy and Jessica's husband Paul Holland. He is described sarcastically by his half-brother Wesley as a Byron-esque figure and is played by the actor Tom Conway. We first meet him on the voyage to St. Sebastian, where he very quickly puts paid to Betsy's romantic perspective of the scenery and of the Caribbean. It's not beautiful, he tells her. Everything seems beautiful because you don't understand. Those flying fish, they're not leaping for joy, they're jumping in terror. Big fish want to eat them. That luminous water, it takes its glow from millions of tiny bodies, the glitter of putrescence. There's no beauty here. Only death and decay. Everything good dies here, even the stars. This piece of dialogue is included to show a contrast between the romantic idealism of Betsy and the hard-edged cynicism of Paul Holland. It also recalls the dynamic between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester and Max de Winter and the unnamed narrator of Rebecca. But more importantly, it also sets up a theme which underpins the movie, a commentary on the legacy of the slave trade, an incredibly radical subtext for a low-budget B-movie made in 1942. This theme is reiterated more explicitly when Betsy is driven to Fort Holland, the home that she will be staying in while on the island. Talking to the black coach driver, she is told that many years ago, Paul's ancestors, quote, brought the long-ago fathers and the long-ago mothers of us all chained to the bottom of a boat, end quote. He goes on to say that the figurehead of the slave ship, named Team Misery, now resides as a statue in the Holland Garden, describing it as, quote, an old man with arrows stuck in him and a sorrowful, weeping look on his black face, end quote. Betsy, with the naivety and ignorance of many tourists, simply responds, well, they certainly brought you to a beautiful place, didn't they? To which the coachman replies, if you say so, miss. If you say so. Film historian Gwenda Young has described this response as polite but contemptuous of Betsy's ignorance, going on to say that this is just one of many examples in the movie that explores the theme of resistance. She cites others, being the calypso singing of the troubadour in the village square, and also the fact that the islanders practice their spiritual beliefs quite openly. Other writers, though, are not in agreement. In her book Horror Noir, writer Robin R. Means Coleman describes the film's approach differently. She says that although the film works to assert that slavery's history and effects remain at the forefront of black people's existence on the island, this particular scene, quote, only illustrates that the filmmakers could not help but weaken any semblance of racial insight with post-colonial fantasy of primitive exoticism and beauty, end quote. Regardless, the theme of slavery and the misery that it caused is certainly a running narrative through the film. This is presented symbolically through the figurehead of Team Misery, crying and pierced with arrows, which is a recurring image throughout the movie. The figurehead also forms the basis of a conversation between Paul and Betsy, when he explains why the locals cry every time a new baby is born. "Do you know what this is?" he asks her. "It was once the figurehead of a slave ship. That's where our people come from the pain, misery, and suffering of slavery. For generations, they found life such a burden that that's why they weep when a child is born and make merry at a funeral. I've told you, Miss Connell, this is a sad place." Team Misery also appears beneath the closing credits, a parting reference to the horrors of slavery that was used instead of the far happier ending originally filmed. Rather than depict Betsy and Paul living happily in snowbound Canada, as had been shot, Lewton scrapped the footage, and instead opted for something that writer Clive Dawson says sends the audience from the theatre, quote, "not with a bromide, but with a resonant image of human suffering." End quote. Once Betsy has settled into Fort Holland, she meets Paul's half-brother, Wesley Rand, played by James Ellison. The polar opposite of Paul, he is American, jovial, and friendly, though we later discover he also has a problem with alcohol. And this is something that is telegraphed by a beautifully subtle glance from Tom Conway as he enters the scene to see Wesley standing with a drink in his hand. And despite his jovial greeting, Wesley too puts paid to Betsy's romantic notions when he reveals that the sounds she has interpreted as being jungle drums are in fact the work drums for the sugar mill. As the narrative develops, we come to learn that before her illness, Jessica and Wesley had been having an affair, and this goes some way to explaining the incredible tension between the two half-brothers. It also goes some way to explaining Wesley's descent into alcoholism following Jessica's illness. This narrative is first announced through a calypso song, performed by the actor and singer Sir Lancelot, who we last saw in Lewton's Curse of the Cat People. Although this song provides a fair amount of exposition, in fact one could call it a musical exposition dump, it also depicts the locals' true perception of the Holland-Rand family. They may be treated with respect to their faces, but behind the scenes they are the subject of mockery and contempt. And although the singer initially apologises, he later doubles down, singing an improvised and mocking verse to Betsy as she tries and fails to rouse Wesley from an alcohol-induced stupor. This segment also introduces us to Mrs. Rand, Wesley and Paul's mother, who is played by Edith Barrett. A seemingly pragmatic woman, though more on that later, she suggests that the nurse use her influence to ensure that alcohol is less of a temptation to her younger son. This suggests that she knows more about Paul and Betsy's burgeoning romance than Betsy does. Perhaps she has eyes and ears at Fort Holland, or perhaps she just understands Paul better than anyone else. Either way, the fact that Paul ultimately agrees to Betsy's request to move the decanter from the dinner table signposts to the viewer his growing affection for the nurse. Unlike her sons, Mrs. Rand seems to be more widely respected in the island community, possibly due to her work in the local pharmacy. When Betsy visits her at the pharmacy a few days later, Mrs. Rand reveals that she tricks the locals, whom she describes as quote-unquote primitive people, into taking medical advice by couching it in magical terms. This does threaten to tip the character into white saviour territory, though, as we will discover, there is far more to her relationship with Vodou than first meets the eye. In fact, her relationship with the spiritual practice is incredibly multi-layered. Like many of Lewton's films, I Walked with a Zombie is incredibly beautiful, thanks to the joint efforts of director Jacques Tourneur and cinematographer J. Roy Hunt. This is first observed beneath the opening credits, where we see two figures walking along the beach, set against a matte painting of clouds stretching into the distance. But perhaps the style of the film, which I would describe as being Lewton's most poetic and Tourneur's most expressionist, only truly comes to the forefront when Betsy unpacks in her room, with the wooden blinds at the windows casting shadows in high contrast black and white. When the manservant comes to advise her that dinner is ready, his arrival is announced through his shadow suddenly appearing on the wall. And this is an image that will be repeated later when the zombie Carrefour arrives at Fort Holland. And in these moments, with their heavily stylized use of shadows cast by both blinds and people, I Walked with a Zombie recalls film noir as much as it does horror. This is also true of the film's first set piece, which is delivered according to Lewton's formula of 3 scenes of suggested terror and 1 of actual violence. This is Betsy's exploration of the tower, where she first meets her patient Jessica, which emphasizes the high contrast cinematography. Depicting Betsy as dwarfed by her surroundings as she mounts the staircase in total darkness, it is an elegantly filmed sequence, combining elements of noir, gothic, and fairy tale, something that is emphasized even further by the appearance of Jessica in her long, white flowing gown. Other arresting moments in the film include a stunning shot of Betsy standing in front of crashing waves, the framing of Betsy and Paul in the doorway after the failed attempt to cure Jessica through insulin therapy, and a masterful tracking shot across the garden, looking through the windows of the fort, first at Paul, then at Wesley, and then at Betsy sneaking Jessica from the tower. This tracking shot leads to perhaps the most famous sequence in the film, where Betsy takes Jessica on a walk through the sugarcane to the Homfort. This is where the locals hold their voodoo ceremonies, and to which Betsy takes her patient in an attempt to find a cure for her illness. Opening with a masterful shot of the zombie Carrefour standing silently amid the sugarcanes, this is quite possibly the most atmospheric sequence of any Lewton film, with the impressive visuals scored only by the sound of the wind blowing through the sugarcane. As well as the commentary on slavery, I Walked with a Zombie also attempts to depict voodoo in a more positive light than many other films of the era, though it has to be said, while the intent is there, the results are rather flawed. Writer Ardell Ray and the rest of the team undertook extensive research at Lewton's request, something that she described in a later interview. Quote, "We all plunged into research on Haitian voodoo, every book on the subject that Val could find. He was an addictive researcher, drawing out of it the overall feel, mood, and quality he wanted, as well as details for the actual production. He got hold of a real calypso singer, Sir Lancelot he was called, a charming, literate, and articulate man. He in turn found some genuine voodoo musicians. I remember they had what they called a papa drum and a mama drum, and that the crew on set were fascinated by them." End quote. As well as, rather unfortunately, William Seabrook's The Magic Island, the reading list included a book called Tell My Horse, a 1938 ethnographic study by the writer Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston was a prominent African-American writer whose work focused on black culture and daily life, and who had played a key role in what is known as the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s. An initiated participant observer in vaudou, her book was far less sensationalist than Seabrook's, demystifying what could be demystified without revealing actual religious secrets, whilst also exploring the impact of US occupation. The songs that we hear throughout the movie were supplied by Leroy Antoine, who had co-authored a book in 1938 called The Voice of Haiti. The first song that we hear on the sailing ship is genuine Haitian Creole and emphasizes the themes of the film, if one can understand the language. For those that can't, myself included, writer Clive Dawson provides a translation in his excellent book about the film, which is published as part of the Devil's Advocate series. "Oh, Marie Congo, my eyes are filled with tears. When I think of my mother, my eyes fill with tears." Antoine also choreographed the vaudou ceremony, which was inspired by photographs of a real ritual that had been reproduced in a 1937 edition of Life magazine. Not only that, Antoine also provided the music for the sequence, which included authentic vaudou songs, one for Papa Legba and another for the Spirit d'Ambala that was cut from the final edit. The ceremony is a deliberate contrast to those more typically shown in films of the time, and most certainly is very different to the one shown in Black Moon, where the spiritual practice was presented as threatening and animalistic, as was the later depiction of New Orleans voodoo in the film Angel Heart. Instead, here there is no threat suggested by the ceremony, and it is presented in a far more respectful fashion, though no doubt it was still rather sensationalist to moviegoers of the time. The same can also be said of the zombie Carrefour, played by Darby Jones. He stands menacingly in the cane fields, and his wide, staring eyes and silent demeanour are clearly meant to terrify, but in reality, he actually presents little to no threat. Before the journey to the Homfort, Alma the maid insists that Jessica and Betsy wear protective patches to ensure that Carrefour will let them pass. Betsy loses hers on the journey, but Carrefour lets her pass anyway. This is doubtless very anticlimactic to the viewer, but once again presents the idea that there is little here to fear. This notion is amplified later, when he arrives at Fort Holland to bring Jessica back to the Homfort, and is stopped in his tracks by a simple command from Mrs. Rand. Even at the film's climax, as he follows Wesley onto the beach, he does little more than watch as Wesley walks into the water carrying Jessica's body. Rather than being terrifying, Carrefour in the movie is a tragic figure, equally as tragic as Jessica, with whom he shares a remarkable passivity. Even before this, though, the idea of voodoo as being frightening or dangerous has been dismissed by the screenplay, most notably in an exchange between Betsy and Paul. "I thought voodoo was something everyone was frightened of," she says, to which Paul responds, "I'm afraid it's not very frightening. They sing and dance and carry on, and then, as I understand it, one of the gods comes down and speaks through one of the people." But while we can dismiss Paul's condescending explanation as being part of his nature, the revelation that the voice of Damballa at the Homfort is in fact not the voice of the spirit, but the voice of Mrs. Rand, is far more problematic. We have mentioned white saviour complex already, and this additional trickery seems to suggest that the black community on the island will believe anything at all if it is couched in spiritual terms. However, we later come to learn that Mrs. Rand is far more of a believer than she first appears, and it is also suggested that there is a lot more to these spiritual practices than Mrs. Rand's smoke and mirrors. These celebrants certainly have power over Jessica, something that is demonstrated in the latter half of the film when they draw her back to the Homfort using a doll. But more importantly than this, as the film draws to its close, we discover that Jessica might be a zombie, or at the very least, Mrs. Rand thinks she is. And the reason that Mrs. Rand thinks this is because she caused the condition in the first place. She may publicly dismiss these ceremonies as being quote-unquote nonsense, but it is quite clear that she believes in voodoo enough to turn to it when she was trying to save her family. Her confession comes at a point in the narrative borrowed not from Charlotte Bronte, but Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, with Paul accused of somehow causing Jessica's condition in much the same way that Max de Winter is accused of Rebecca's murder. "I went to the Homfort," she says. "I kept seeing Jessica's face, smiling because she was beautiful enough to take my family in her hands and tear it apart. And I said that the woman at Fort Holland was evil, and that the Hungon must make her into a zombie." So, hardly the actions of a non-believer. What is intriguing about the film, though, as with so much of Lewton's work, is that the viewer never really knows whether Jessica is a zombie or just extremely ill. We know that she suffered from a fever and temporarily slipped into a coma, but whether she is actually one of the walking dead is never made completely clear. Nor, in fact, do we really know whether Carrefour is a zombie or whether he too is suffering from some form of medical condition. While this was also the approach that Lewton wanted to take with Cat People, in that movie the studio interfered with his plans and insisted on the insertion of a panther in later scenes. But in I Walked with the Zombie, there is no such obvious intrusion. The only clue, perhaps, is in the rather garish makeup in which Jessica first appears in the tower sequence, which is far more typically ghoul-like than her countenance in the rest of the movie, where she appears to be a remarkably beautiful, if catatonic, young woman. It is likely that Lewton abandoned this more obvious approach partway through filming, and the ambiguity lends the film's ending a far more darker edge than one might first imagine. If Jessica is indeed a zombie, then Wesley's killing of her in the cane fields and subsequent suicide is tragic but understandable. If, however, she was just very sick, we are left with something far more questionable, a murder-suicide of a tragically ill woman that makes the climax of the movie one of the darkest in the Lewton canon. That is, at least, until we get to the seventh victim in 1943, though that's a story for a different episode. On its release in 1942, the film met with predictably mixed reviews. The New York Daily News called it a spine-chilling horror film, and surprisingly enough, a publication called Parents Magazine noted that it was a deluxe horror film that, quote, depends for its effect not on sensationalism, but on good storytelling, intelligent direction, believable acting, and appropriate but not overemphasized background music, end quote. But as regular listeners might have guessed by now, the New York Times was not so impressed. And this is something that may well have been triggered by the film's rather more positive depiction of alternative religions. Their review called it, quote, a dull, disgusting exaggeration of an unhealthy, abnormal concept of life, end quote, going on to suggest that the youth of America should be safeguarded from the stuff and nonsense their minds will absorb when watching the film. Regardless of the reviews, though, the film was a huge success, earning as much as its predecessor Cat People while being produced on a far lower budget. Today, it is viewed as the best of the Lewton Tourneur trilogy, and therefore the best of all of the Lewton movies put together. It is beautiful, poetic, and ambiguous, and while it may slip into stereotyping at points, its intentions at least were honourable, even if sometimes the delivery falters. Following the American occupation, Haiti was governed for 5 years by its first civilian president, who introduced social and economic reforms until his government was overthrown by a military junta. Following a period of instability, François Duvalier, also known as Papa Doc, was elected president of Haiti on September the 22nd, 1957, although the election was widely reported to be marked by voter intimidation and fraud. After thwarting a military coup d'etat in 1958, his regime became more autocratic, and in 1961 he was unanimously re-elected in a presidential election in which he was the only candidate. After this, he consolidated his powers step by step, culminating in 1964 when he declared himself president for life under a sham referendum and election. His regime is regarded as one of the most oppressive and corrupt of modern times, particularly in the use of his undercover government death squad, the Tonton Macoute, which indiscriminately tortured or killed his opponents. Numbering more than 300,000 members and consuming more than half of the government budget, the Tonton Macoute was thought to be so pervasive that Haitians became fearful of expressing any form of dissent, even in private. He also further sought to solidify his rule by incorporating elements of Haitian mythology and Vodou into what became a cult of personality. During the Cold War, his dictatorship was supported by the US government, who provided millions of dollars in aid and training for his security forces due to the island's proximity to Cuba and the fact that he was seen as a bulwark against the forces of communism. On his death, he was succeeded by his son Jean-Claude, also known as Baby Doc, who continued his father's reign of brutality whilst embezzling the funds of the country. This included foreign aid, an amount that has been estimated at anywhere between $300 to $900 million. Maintaining a lifestyle of luxury while his citizens suffered, he went into exile in 1986, following pressure from the US government. What followed was even more instability, with military leaders attempting to take control of the government, leading to political violence, including the massacre of voters on Election Day in 1987. By 1991, the country was under military rule until US intervention in 1994, which led to the temporary return of democracy. However, the country remained highly unstable, with a coup d'etat taking place in 2004 and various successive governments also accused of corruption. In 2010, the country was decimated by an earthquake, from which it has yet to fully recover. Instability and violence continue to this day, with open gang warfare and violence in many cities, particularly the capital, Port-au-Prince. Again, this has been a very potted history of the country, sitting at the intersection of colonialism, slavery, race, revolution, and geopolitics. The story of Haiti is an incredibly challenging one to tell, particularly when narratives have been distorted by French and US perspectives. So, please note that any errors or omissions on my part have been unintentional, and I have tried, at least, to tell this story with as much respect as possible. I will end this section by reiterating that I hope this episode will act as a fundraiser for a school that is run with no small amount of difficulty by a young man in Haiti called Ronnie. As I mentioned earlier, the school's Instagram and GoFundMe will be linked in the show notes, and if any listeners could donate even the smallest amount, I would be extremely grateful. But, of course, we cannot really talk about colonialism without talking about my own country and the supposed British Empire. Starting in the late 16th century with merchant companies like the rather notorious East India Company and US settlements established by the Pilgrims, we are hardly innocent in our own attempts to exploit resources, drive slavery, and inflict widespread death and violence. Spanning roughly 400 years and controlling 24% of the Earth's land area and 23% of the global population by 1913, the British Empire was the largest in history. Imposing British rule, tradition, and of course taxation, the empire reduced many nations to poverty from which they haven't recovered, as well as eroding indigenous practices as we spread our own perversion of so-called Christianity. I'm not even going to attempt to go into any great detail here, as we would be here for a very long time. But suffice it to say that the Spanish and the French were most certainly not the only European countries to exploit and decimate foreign populations in the accumulation of wealth and power. Known as the land on which the sun never sets, due to its sheer global reach, it is impossible to calculate an exact number of how many people the British Empire killed. Estimates for deaths relating to colonial policies, imported disease, famine and conflict range from tens of millions to over 100 million. It was really only as a result of the economic and military strain of World War II that the British Empire fell, coupled with the rise of the US and the Soviet Union as the dominant world powers following the conflict. Even then, the land where the sun never set still cast a long shadow, one that was tentatively explored by Hammer Studios with two films they released in 1966, The Plague of the Zombies and The Reptile. Produced at a time when the British Empire was on its very last legs, both films suggest that post-colonial return to Britain would bring back untold horrors, whether through exploitation, as in Plague of the Zombies, or, as in The Reptile, a form of revenge for interference and cultural appropriation. All of which then brings us on to our second film of the week, which is indeed The Reptile. This was directed by John Gilling and stars Jennifer Daniel, Noel Willman, Ray Barrett, Jacqueline Pearce, and Michael Ripper. And we are getting into heavy spoilers right away with this one, so, as always, please approach carefully if you have yet to see the film. By the mid-1960s, the Dracula and Frankenstein franchises were beginning to run out of steam, and Hammer were looking to bolster their finances and retain their reputation as leaders in the horror market. In an attempt to do this and to improve efficiency, in 1964, producer Anthony Nelson Keyes proposed to the studio that if they made 4 films back-to-back, they would benefit from reusing sets and actors, and be able to bring in each movie for £100,000 each. The films, which were all to be shot at the company's Bray Studios in Berkshire, were Dracula Prince of Darkness, Rasputin the Mad Monk, The Plague of the Zombies, and The Reptile. The plan was then to release them as double features, with The Plague of the Zombies, the B-movie to Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and The Reptile acting as support to Rasputin the Mad Monk. But Plague and The Reptile, which are often known as Hammer's Cornish duo, would turn out to share more than just sets and the acting talents of Jacqueline Pearce and Michael Ripper. As mentioned, both films touch on the legacy of colonialism, featuring monsters that represent the transgressions of the British establishment. In Plague of the Zombies, Squire Clive Hamilton returns to England from Haiti and perverts the island religion of Vodou for his own ends, creating a legion of zombies to work in his family tin mine. Meanwhile, in The Reptile, the cultural appropriation committed by Dr. Franklin results in a religious order enacting a terrible revenge, turning his daughter Anna into a shape-shifting snake woman that runs havoc in the English countryside. The Reptile belongs to a small group of films that can be categorized as snake woman movies, a subgenre that includes Universal's 1955 horror Cult of the Cobra and the 1961 British offering The Snake Woman. The film began life as a screenplay by Anthony Hines, who had worked as a producer for Hammer for nearly 2 decades, beginning with their 1948 crime drama Who Killed Van Loon, before progressing on to more famous fare, including 1955's The Quatermass Experiment, its 1957 sequel Quatermass 2, and the films that sent the studio stratospheric, 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein and 1958's Dracula. Writing under the pseudonym of John Elder, he was also a prolific screenwriter, and the first of his Hammer screenwriting credits was in 1961 with Curse of the Werewolf, which starred Oliver Reed and also Hammer's most regular cast member, Michael Ripper. Other screenplays that he wrote for the studio include 1962's The Phantom of the Opera, Kiss of the Vampire in 1963, and The Evil of Frankenstein from 1964. Originally titled The Curse of the Reptiles, Hines' screenplay was submitted to Universal for financing in 1963. Gaining no real interest from the studio, it sat on the shelf for a couple of years until it was resurrected for the 4th of Hammer's back-to-back filming experiment. At this point, it was retitled The Reptiles, and then it was shortened once again to The Reptile, presumably due to budgetary restrictions. Rather unusually for a Hammer movie of the period, it opens with a prologue featuring a male victim, Charles Spaulding, who meets a rather nasty end after being bitten on the neck by a barely glimpsed figure. We soon discover that his death is just one of many that have blighted the Cornish village of Clagmore Heath, a series of events that have been attributed by the locals to a disease they call the Black Death. Charles's brother Harry soon arrives in the village with his wife Valerie, having inherited his brother's cottage and also being rather understandably curious about his death. To say that they find the locals hostile is something of an understatement. On visiting the local pub to ask for directions, Harry is met with deathly stares straight out of a Wild West saloon, and when they finally arrive at Larkrise Cottage, they find its contents in disarray, as if it has been ransacked. Enraged, Harry returns to the pub and accuses the locals, who take no small amount of umbrage and walk out en masse. This leaves Harry alone with the only friendly face, the landlord, Tom Bailey. He is played by regular Hammer actor and fan favourite Michael Ripper, here finally given a much larger, and it has to be said, ultimately heroic role. Michael Ripper was born in 1913 in Portsmouth, England. He began his film career in the 1930s in what would be known as quota quickies, intentionally low-budget and generally low-quality movies made between 1927 and 1930. These were made to satisfy the demands of a piece of 1927 legislation called the Cinematograph Films Act, which required a minimum percentage of British movies to be screened in cinemas. Designed to stimulate the declining British film industry, the act instead spawned a succession of B-movies, cheaply made, shot at speed, and generally sneered at for their perceived low quality. Despite this, though, they acted as a training ground for both actors and directors, while also providing work during the uncertain interwar years and the Great Depression. Names that got their start working on these films include directors Michael Powell and David Lean, and actors including Vivien Leigh, James Mason, Laurence Olivier, John Mills, and of course, Michael Ripper. Often appearing in uncredited bit parts, Ripper's first screen credit was as the simply titled Crook in a low-budget 1937 movie called Busman's Holiday. Following this, he continued in minor roles, often still uncredited, for several years. Over time, he graduated into slightly larger roles, appearing in films including 1948's Oliver Twist, directed by fellow Quota Quickie graduate David Lean. In the same year, he started working for Hammer Studios, first appearing in their 1948 film The Dark Road, which is also known as There Is No Escape. Following this, he would appear in more Hammer movies than any other actor, and while many of them may have been minor roles, his face is now instantly recognisable to British horror fans. Other roles for the studio include X the Unknown in 1956, Quatermass 2 in 1957, The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958, and The Curse of the Werewolf in 1961. His character in The Reptile, Tom Bailey, is possibly his biggest role for the studio, but it's still one of several barmen and pub landlords that he played across his career. However, in a performance that delights many a Hammer horror fan, this time he is the hero of the piece, certainly far more so than nominal leading man Harry Spalding, who is played by Australian actor Ray Barrett. It is Tom Bailey who initiates the investigation into the mysterious deaths and who ultimately saves Valerie from the attack of the reptile woman, smashing the windows of the house to introduce a paralysing cold air that freezes the monster in her tracks. Despite this, Ripper did not consider the film to be his favourite, naming instead his performance in The Mummy's Shroud, which was released in 1967. That film, he said, was one of the few times he got to play a sympathetic character, and he also received good notices for the pathos he brought to the role. While this is certainly true, and perhaps that character does have more depth than Tom Bailey, I have to say it is glorious to see him, for once, play the hero of the piece, even if the beard that he is saddled with is rather obviously glued on with spirit gum. And reviews of the time would agree with me about the performance, if not the beard. On the film's release in 1966, the Daily Cinema gave Ripper's performance a great deal of praise, writing, quote, "Ripper's performance of the dullest character in all these horror movies, the helpful friend, is a most sensitive job of acting. It's time they started giving awards for the most distinguished roles rather than for the best performance in the best roles. Then the artists, who are truly the backbone of the industry, would get the credit that's due to them." End quote. The reptile, Anna, is played by Jacqueline Pearce, who, along with Ripper, is the only returning cast member from the Plague of the Zombies. Anna is a deeply tragic figure, essentially a variant of a werewolf who has been cursed through her father's interference with an obscure religious group, as opposed to any transgression of her own. It's a terribly sad performance of some depth, alternating between weak and terrified to becoming a figure of horror. Perhaps her best moment in the film is the sequence in which she plays a sitar to enrage her father, her eyes flashing with defiance until he takes the instrument and smashes it to pieces. In a later interview, Pearce recalled being asked to join the film while still shooting its predecessor, The Plague of the Zombies, in which she had a small but equally sympathetic role as Alice. "Before we finished shooting on The Plague of the Zombies," she said, "the producer called me into his office and said, 'You've got a marvellous face for films. I'd like you to play the reptile,' going on to say she never really quite understood that comment." Pearce also plays Anna in her reptile form, a process that required hours of work at the hands of makeup artist Roy Ashton. A sufferer of claustrophobia, she later recalled how restrictive she found both the makeup and the makeup process, saying, quote, "It was stuck on piecemeal with a kind of glue. Then, at the end of the day, it had to be taken off with surgical spirit. So the skin on my face was left very raw. It wasn't fun. It was very painful and uncomfortable, as well as being very creepy and claustrophobic. The only thing that I can say is that the Reptile makeup was better than I looked when I arrived there first thing in the morning. I can tell you that." End quote. Sadly, despite the efforts of Ashton and the suffering of Pearce, the Reptile makeup is not particularly convincing, particularly in close-up. After seeing the dailies, Anthony Nelson Keyes ordered reshoots, which was an almost unheard-of request for a studio that was trying to keep costs low. By this time, the other 3 films in the shooting schedule had run far over budget, and Keyes was determined to bring this one in under projection, pushing director John Gilling as far as he possibly could. It has to be said that Gilling does his best with what he has to work with, obscuring the Reptile makeup as much as possible through the use of shadow and rapid cutting. But her final appearance at the end of the film, with crossed eyes and a very artificial look, does tend to undermine the effects somewhat. Far more effective is the makeup used to represent the Black Death, the horrific condition that is triggered by Anna's venom. First seen on Charles, and then on the local Mad Peter, the victims are reduced to a gurgling, incoherent state as their faces blacken and they begin foaming at the mouth. Equally nasty is the bite that is unexpectedly inflicted on Harry when he visits the Franklin Manor, after which he runs home and, in a very good performance from actor Ray Barrett, begs through laboured, burbling speech for Valerie to cut the toxin from his neck. Valerie is played by Jennifer Daniel, who had previously worked for Hammer in their 1963 horror The Kiss of the Vampire. A brave and intrepid heroine, it is she who takes the lead following Harry's near-fatal experience at the manor, returning to the house to try to help Anna and also discovering the family secret in the process. The reveal of the truth comes from Dr. Franklin, played by Daniel's Kiss of the Vampire co-star Noel Willman. Although he is initially set up to be the villain of the piece, he is just as tragic a figure as Anna, though it has to be remembered her condition is essentially his fault to begin with. Had he not been so curious and so invasive in his desire to research mysterious religions, then his daughter would never have been turned into a monster. Although the film deals with the impact of colonialism and cultural appropriation, much like I Walked with a Zombie, it is not without its issues. For example, the depiction of the Malaysian manservant, performed by Anglo-Indian actor Man Maitland, borders on racial stereotype as a dangerous foreigner, lurking mysteriously in doorways and staring menacingly through cottage windows. At the very least, though, his character is marginally less offensive than a similar figure in a 1975 Tyburn production called The Ghoul. This film, which uses pretty much the same plot device as The Reptile, substitutes Maitland for British actress Gwen Watford, very unfortunately in brownface, playing an Indian servant to Peter Cushing. Both The Reptile and The Plague of the Zombies were directed by John Gilling, a film director and screenwriter who began his career as an assistant to his uncle, William P. Colino, one of the founding figures of the British film industry. When his uncle became too old to continue directing, Gilling moved on to assisting other directors, and then made his own directorial debut in 1948 with a 38-minute B-movie titled Escape from Broadmoor. From here, he graduated to crime films, including A Matter of Murder in 1949, The Quiet Woman in 1951, and The Frightened Man in 1952. At the same time, he also began a working relationship with Hammer, writing the screenplay for their 1950 movie The Man in Black, a film adaptation of the BBC radio series Appointment with Fear. He continued the relationship with the screenplay for their Jack the Ripper-inspired Room to Let, which was also released in 1950. Alongside his screenwriting, he also continued his directing career, which included the 1952 horror comedy, and I'm playing very fast and loose with both words, Old Mother Riley Meets the Vampire. This starred British comic Arthur Lewton in drag as the titular Mrs. Riley and Hollywood legend Bela Lugosi as the vampire. Although the end result is far from what you could call enjoyable, Gilling recalled that Lugosi and Lewton had a great time on set and also felt that Lugosi was a superb melodramatic actor who was a joy to work with. In 1960, he directed Peter Cushing and Donald Pleasance in the Burke and Hare-inspired movie The Flesh and the Fiends, and in the same year also directed the Hammer horror film Shadow of the Cat. Gilling later said that his relationship with the studio was somewhat tempestuous, mainly due to Anthony Nelson Keyes and Anthony Hines, neither of whom he particularly respected. Regardless, he was brought back into the fold to direct a trilogy of films for them in the mid-1960s, The Plague of the Zombies and The Reptile in 1965, and a year later The Mummy's Shroud, all of which would feature Michael Ripper. Of his work with Gilling, Ripper later said, quote, "John was certainly not the best director I've ever worked with, but to be quite honest with you, he always did manage to bring out the best in me as an actor. I was always pleased with my performances under his direction. I thoroughly enjoyed working with him, although we would occasionally clash." End quote. Not exactly a fan of the original screenplays for either Plague of the Zombies or The Reptile, Gilling went about making extensive rewrites, sometimes even on the day of shooting. Some of these changes were stipulated by the censors, while others were rewritten because, for Gilling, they made little to no sense. This is particularly true of the climax of the movie, which in the screenplay had Valerie being bitten by the reptile but somehow surviving, possibly because Anna's venom supplies had been depleted by the earlier attack on her father. Either way, for Gilling, this was one plot contrivance too many, and he rewrote the ending on the day of the filming to the one we now see in the final version. Managing to bring the film in within budget, Gilling does deliver some highly effective moments. The very early attacks of the reptile are handled with great gusto, and the scenes where both Mad Peter and Harry return to the cottage after being bitten are brilliantly done. He does what he can with the limitations of Anna's reptile makeup, and also manages some fairly evocative scenes in the cellar below the Franklin mansion, and also in the moment where Dr. Franklin discovers Anna's shed skin in her bedroom. Admittedly, of the Cornish duo, The Plague of the Zombies is probably the better film, but The Reptile works well within the confines of its budget. Like many Hammer movies, for me it is something of a comfort film, something that I watch when I'm not feeling very well or I haven't really got anything better to do. It's not the best of their output by any means, but as a weird and very strange monster movie, it is far better than its B-movie origins would have you expect. The Reptile was released as a double bill with the higher-profile Rasputin the Mad Monk in March 1966. Reviews on the whole were positive, with the Monthly Film Bulletin highlighting its colonialism subtext, saying, quote, "Instead of the customary bloodlettings, we are invited to observe with nervous curiosity the slow self-destruction of a proud but superstitious man, incapable of rescuing his daughter from the fate half wished upon her by himself. Altogether, this is a film of some merit." End quote. Time Out singled Jacqueline Pearce for praise, while AllMovie wrote that, although there were inconsistencies in the script, the film was handsomely mounted and delivered its fair share of shocks. Perhaps the best review of all, though, came from Monster Mania magazine, which described the film as, quote, "one of the most terrifying pictures that the company has made in quite some time. We'd like to warn you that the first glimpse you get of the reptile will stun you. It's the biggest jolt that Hammer has given the public since the unforgettable sequence in The Horror of Dracula when Christopher Lee made his entrance." End quote. Following the decline of Hammer Studios and the general decline of the British film industry, In the early 1970s, Michael Ripper moved from film into television, including appearances in shows like The Two Ronnies, Man About the House, Butterflies, Tales of the Unexpected, and Wurzel Gummidge. His final screen appearances were in the BBC soap opera EastEnders in 1993 and 1995. He died in the year 2000 at the age of 87. After her dual roles in The Plague of the Zombies and The Reptile, Jacqueline Pearce didn't work for Hammer again. She did, however, gain a new legion of fans and a cult following for her performance as the female supervillain Servalan in the BBC science fiction series Blake 7, and this role was described by The Times as prompting, quote, a sexual awakening for a generation of sci-fi fans, end quote. She then continued in a similar vein as memorable villains in children's TV dramas Moondial in 1988 and Dark Season in 1993. In the early 2000s, she lent her distinctive vocal talents to audio dramas for both Blake 7 and Doctor Who, which, combined with her duo of Hammer movies, ensured a lasting legacy among genre fans of both science fiction and horror. She died from cancer in 2018 at the age of 74. I Walked with the Zombie and The Reptile both began life as B-movies, filmed with limited budgets and an intention from both studios that they would be little more than passing shockers. I Walked with the Zombie certainly surpasses expectations due to the combination of Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur, and while The Reptile may stick more closely to its low-budget origins, it still manages some highly effective moments. Both films explore the consequences and repercussions of colonialism, and while they may have moments that are not going to sit entirely comfortably with a modern audience, both at least try to explore a theme that you wouldn't necessarily have found in B-movie horrors of their respective times. Together, they tell us that interference in foreign cultures comes at a terrible price, often carried unto the next generation, and that the consequences of intrusion will linger long after the original trespass is a distant memory. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also remember, you can always email in to thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can follow our Instagram account at thehorrordouble. Next week, appropriately enough for a Sunday, we are heading to church with a double bill that presents our holiest of houses as a place of malevolence and horror. First up, we have John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness from 1987, starring Donald Pleasance, Victor Wong, Jameson Parker, and Anne-Marie Howard. Then we follow this with British found footage horror The Borderlands, which was also released in some territories as Final Prayer. This was released in 2013 and was directed by Elliot Goldner and stars Gordon Kennedy, Aidan McCardle, and Robin Hill. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com, and if not available in your country and you've got a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.